Questions?
Dr. Collier, Dr. Lund, thank you. Council members, questions, comments?
Gentlemen, I want to commend you. I think it was first of all, it was intellectually interesting. It was interesting to read, and I thought a very balanced presentation. But in some ways, I feel guilty because you paid too much attention to the charge we gave you, which is the same thing I'd say to the independent panel. They were bound because the governmental process about BDCP is shortly going to move, at least in my judgment, to the question of what does the final thing look like? And it is the taking of the evaluation you've done and the converting of the recommendations and observations into meaningful changes that, to me, is kind of the measure of whether this effort has been successful. So it's probably fair to say, gee, we couldn't evaluate a lot of things because you haven't specified the details of amount of monitoring and scope of activity and standards and all of that. But at the same time, I would like to be able to draw from the ISB report and from the independent panel report things that get converted into public policy changes that somebody like me might understand and, if they seem appropriate, advocate. I think the most, interestingly enough, the most positive thing you did for this process is to kind of merge the John Ween's good enough phrase into the best available science, which is how most people understand it, but that's an extremely powerful measure and tool. But if you had to say, here are the 10 things that should be immediately inserted into BDCP to civilize the process and meet our goals, not go back and do it all over again so we can take a look at it, what would those things be? What would a structure look like? What would the funding look like? What would the scientific involvement be? It's fine to say we've got a Delta Science plan out there, but how ready is it to go in actual operation? And I'm sure you had these discussions. It wasn't part of your charge, which is why you didn't answer it. Got any...
I'll defer to Dr. Lund. I was fast on that one.
I noticed.
I was thinking about that while he was talking. So.
Well, I think in the details, the last couple of pages of the shortest document we have of our
our pages are not numbered, so
well,
I don't know
there's only
how
10
we'll find
pages,
anything.
It's only 13 pages.
10 of real
Okay,
text.
so which section are you talking about?
Well, the last 2 pages on how to improve the document.
How to improve the document. There's
The
a
8
nice
items.
list, I
Okay.
think.
All right.
And then before that, there's the
improvements in the scientific framework.
right. So that section and the section following it, I think, are where we tried to nail those down a little bit or be precise.
I want to move aside the drafting of the BDCP for a minute. I think those are important statements, and selling a project or an idea or a concept is fundamental. But I'm interested in the first point is develop adaptive institutional, regulatory, scientific, human resources, and financial capacities. Okay.
If you can do that, you can do anything.
Well, that's our charge back to the council.
Yeah, but you know, this is the. By the way, this is a repetitive thing that comes up in every report, every version of BDCP, every single element, every scientific comment on it. If it has to be good enough, what are the things on institutional capacity that are required for you guys to say good enough? If you can say that.
Yeah, I think that's a good. Yeah.
So we recognize when it's easy to call out for adaptive management to be supported and institutionalized. Right. It's hard to do, and it's harder to do in a system like this with this complexity. So just yesterday, we met with the science program, and we are sketching out, Jay and I, and we haven't shared this with the rest of the board yet, so it's still provisional, but I think that we will get buy-in. We are going to work with the science program to try to figure out what information do we need from agencies and actors and players in the region that are supporting adaptive management? Can we get consistent information about that? Can we get a view of something that we can review to see what's working and what's not working and where we need to put more resources, where we at least need to put more science resources? We think that's an important, we're a little bit frightened to actually tackle that, but we realize that people want us to say what that means. So from the science perspective, that's probably our next major topic. We'll continue with some of our subject matter reviews, but
Results of that available in next week?
Next week, which year? So yeah.
Well,
No, but for us, this is going to be through the summer and into the fall trying to figure out, because in order to meet our statutory charge to review the science underpinning adaptive management in the region, in the Delta, we've got to figure out what that is that we're going to review. And we have to have a way to call for that information for people.
As I read this, you've advocated broadly collaborative yet decisive governance.
Well, yeah.
Is
there something
I give
wrong
you
with
the
that?
citation to the section or the page, but as I said, it's not numbered. Yes, that's what you said. But the reader's going to say, okay, what is it? And it is the answer to that question that has the potential of eventually changing the BDCP proposal that is finally subject to decision makers, federal and state level, and adoption.
I guess one of our conversation yesterday, we were talking about adaptive management and how everyone seems to be using the term differently, and the most cynical interpretation of a lot of the use of adaptive management is just promising to fix it later. And I think there seems to be a fair number of occasions when adaptive management is used in that sense. This problem is too important for the state and the ecosystem and the locals I think to have that kind of an attitude. My own disappointment with the document is that they play lip service to adaptive management, and they have sort of a diagram with goes in circles like everybody else does, but I mean, this is a really hard thing to do. It's going to require serious money. I joked yesterday that if everyone was taxed a dime every time they said adaptive management, we might have enough funding for this.
I think it'd take $1, but
yeah. It illustrates to me the difficulty of getting it done, that hasn't been specified. And to me, it raises a real threat on the likely effectiveness of this project if you cannot muster a functional adaptive management program. So it's a real challenge, I think, to the BDCP folks to muster an effective adaptive management program and to define what that is. You know, come up with the financial resources, the expertise, the administrative authorities that would allow you to have a hope of it being effective. Otherwise, it really kind of amounts to promising to fix things later. And I guess that's sort of what we're trying to get at. We didn't feel convinced by the end of the documents.
So like the lack of contingency plans, you know, we felt the contingency plans for a lot of these things, you could develop them now, at least in concept.
That was going to be my next query to you.
Or a process for contingency planning even.
Yeah, right.
Doing contingency planning always sounds terrific because it's based on the belief that either we can guarantee an outcome by having 75 contingent plans out there, and when something doesn't work, we'll turn to number 2 and then 3 and then 4. But everything collective science has told us for over 4 years now is there are things happening we don't know anything about. This could work, it might not work. Only time and the accumulation of new information and significant testing of ideas will determine that. So in some sense, you also are putting off the determination of what a scientific review would automatically conclude in the future. But you're doing it because you'd like to see a more collaborative yet decisive governance that involves science, I would assume. And that latter point seems to me to be the area where your judgments are better able to be done now. You can't guarantee to a 99.76% accuracy what will happen 50 years from now. Or you'd complain bitterly about it if somebody asked you to do that. But you can at least tell us what a structure ought to look like, what a funding ratio ought to look like. There are some comparison projects. Arcadis studied 4, I believe, where some form of adaptive management's been out there. And you've mentioned, I guess, I'm not sure all of them were identical, but you've mentioned similar projects. But there is no such thing as the gold standard adaptive management that anyone can find. So if we had to start and construct one on a structural basis, that seems to me to be where policymakers are closer to being able to understand that approach than anything else. And do you think this work with the science program will likely come up with something that answers those questions? At least good enough answers?
My view, it's a really necessary step to try to figure out what kind of information would go into developing that structure and how you would try to build it and resource it. My personal view on this is that, yeah, we're not going to come up with an adaptive management plan that's going to be ready to go when we start turning dirt. But we do need to put in the time to figure out where are we going to get the resources for the monitoring, where are we going to get the resources for the staff time to do the evaluations, how do we determine contingency plans or alternative, do we have alternatives that we're going to implement if things go this direction versus this direction? And I just don't see that in here. I don't see that there is that thought to, and maybe it's not part of the EIRS, but it still needs to be part of the thinking about the project, is what are we going to do? Where are we going to build the resources so that we can actually gather information, analyze it, assess it, and act on it, both management-wise and policy-wise, as well as the science basis-wise. And in my experience, nobody does that. Nobody says before they start something big, what's the overall evaluation process going to be? How are we going to resource it? You start it, and then you start getting surprises, and then you start reacting to the surprises. And that's human nature to an extent, which is outside the realm of our technical review, I might just point out. So, although there is social science.
Are you not scientists?
Yeah. I stepped into that one. My social scientists up in Puget Sound better not watch this. Anyway, so that's, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's not enough thought in what we saw in the documents to say we are planning for how to really try to support adaptive management, even though we don't know what it's exactly going to look like. We don't see the preparation taking place to try to resource and put that into place. But there are people talking about it. That's good, but we need to do more than be talking as we go down the road to a project implementation.
Okay. Questions? Judge?
Expose my views. Judges don't like to do that,
button down.
I can't help it. Kind of along the lines of what Phil was talking about. Can the processes of government really ever catch up to this virtual explosion of science? I mean, it seems to me that the government, like the law, is very static. At a point in time, you make a decision. You guys never sleep. I mean, your knowledge just flows, and because it's the nature of science. And it's hard to fit science into either the political or the legal process because we stumble and start and we stumble and start again. You guys don't. And this is obviously kind of theoretical.
Wow.
Occasionally.
We've got
I had this conversation with Peter, though. We had our little discussion with the other folks in the science program here. But you understand my question? I mean, it's really frustrating because, it seems like we can never catch up with you. And that's the way it ought to be. But how does government react under those circumstances? To be decisive, that means a decision is made. At what point in time do we make that decision?
So a decision's made, and then you've got to have a community of people, not just scientists, who are able and ready to help evaluate the outcome of that decision. My background in toxicology, look at the flame retardants in couch cushions. We've spent the last 30 years basically intoxicating people with these compounds based on a faulty science premise that we didn't know about until 5 years ago because we never put into place an assessment of some of the assumptions that we made when we put those things into our couch cushions. It was, in my view, a tremendous failure of the science policy interface to not be assessing the outcome of that decision, and it was based on faulty science to start with. So, but at the same time, I want to just say we always get told, by Phil mostly, but I get up in Puget Sound, science is way too slow for our process. We need the science and we need it now, and we can't wait for you guys to design the studies and do the implementation. So we always feel that we're behind you. That said, I appreciate what you're saying about you're making decisions, implementing policies, new science is coming along that's saying, well, you could have done better or you should have done different. It's my view, I think what they're doing down here with the Delta Science Program and having these focused groups, much like this one and some of the other groups that they've been pulling together, the review groups, they are trying to synthesize science knowledge that will support current management actions or decisions that are needed. And that's about, from my experience, about as best as we can do. And we need to do more of that science synthesis and science policy interactions. The policy folks need to help the science community define what science they need to support their decisions. And then the science groups need to, in some cases, go do research if there isn't information out there, but that is too slow for your process. But in other cases, they should do the synthesis of what we already know and deliver it as imperfect as it is and with as many uncertainties as it has to policy folks and to technical people who understand policy, and they can then use that in their decisions.
But this gets back, I wrote here somewhere about
It's philosophical.
projects' effect on the environment rather than the environment's effect on the project. Kind of like the idea of science effect on this project versus what the policymakers want to do with this project. Please give us an answer. I mean, I think science has a more dominant role in this process, perhaps than the policymakers have, because I think the policymakers have to follow science. So it's a little different than I think the paradigm you described. I mean, it seems to me science is the lead in many ways, and it's unusual. Maybe this is the future, but it seems to me that strikes me that that's what we're doing here.
Yeah, I guess I have a little different view of it. We should all have a common interest in building things that work.
Right.
And by work, in the context of the Delta, we have the co-equal goals, tri-equal goals, however you'd like to define it. And the system is complex enough and is changing enough that we can't be sure. So the decisions are going to have to change over time. And they're going to have, and good strategic decisions should be made that allow you to adapt over time. The science side, the technical side, needs to be able to organize these problems and organize these issues so that the decision making can be adaptive and the resources can be accumulated so that when things aren't going right, you have the capabilities of changing your decisions, both financially and legally. So I see these things sort of going together in a very pragmatic way. This is not sort of science as an ethereal process that we in the ivory tower would often like. There'll be some of that, and some of that's important, but quite a lot of it is just getting your own agency science organized so that it can be responsive in letting you know of things before you get blindsided, letting you know how well things are working, how things are likely to fail, and what to do if they don't go well, and how to take advantage of opportunities. Sometimes you'll do things and they work out better than you expected. I was reminded last night there was a nice PBS special on D-Day. This is the time of year for that. There's a wonderful quote from Eisenhower that the plan is nothing but planning and is everything. And you can, if you look at the history of D-Day, where that quote I think probably comes from, is look at all the different contingencies they looked at. No individual contingency actually happened, but they were prepared, they were organized to be able to change as things went on. They had the resources mustered. They'd thought a lot of things through, but not everything through. But that mode of thinking, that mode of being able to make decisions and learn new things as you were going along apparently worked.
Good answer. Figure that one out.
All right. It seems that we have reached a conclusion to these presentations. Dr. Parker, on behalf of the Council, please express our appreciation to your colleagues on the Effects Analysis panel and for all of the hard work that you put into preparing and presenting your report. Thank you. And Dr. Collier and Dr. Lunn, also to your colleagues on the Independent Science Board, we appreciate the depth of knowledge and expertise that exists within your body and bringing that to bear on this issue and helping us to formulate our comments in response to the EIR-EIS process. Sam, Marina, thank you for assembling this panel. And I believe now, Dan, we are ready to consider the Council's comments. This will be file item